The air was sharp, filled with the smell of snow and smoke. Private Otto Müller, 19 years old, stood with his rifle pointed toward the edge of a pit outside the village of Vitebsk. Before him, a group of civilians, men, women, and a few children, stood trembling in the cold. Behind him, his sergeant barked orders over the wind. "You know what to do, Müller. Don't make me repeat myself." Otto's hands shook, not from the cold but from something deeper, something breaking inside. He joined the Wehrmacht a year ago, not out of ideology, but because every boy his age was expected to. His father had been a soldier in the Great War. His mother told him to serve with honor. But standing here, rifle aimed at civilians, Otto wondered if there was any honor left in Germany. He had already seen too much. When his unit entered the Soviet village 2 days earlier, they were met not with soldiers but peasants. The resistance fighters had long fled. The order came down from command. All suspected partisans and Jews are to be liquidated. That night, Otto couldn't sleep. He wrote in his small, torn notebook, "They call it duty, but I see only murder." He thought of his younger sister back home, of how she sent him letters with pressed flowers inside. He wondered what she would think if she saw what duty looked like here. Sergeant Weber was a man of stone, older, scarred, loyal to orders. He had fought in Poland, in France, and believed that obedience was survival. When Otto hesitated, Weber's voice cut through the silence. "You think you're better than the rest of us, boy? You think your hands are clean?" Otto didn't answer. He looked down at his boots. The mud, the frost, the blood that wasn't his. Weber pressed the barrel of his pistol to Otto's shoulder. "If you don't do it, I will. And then I'll shoot you too." Time slowed. Otto looked at the faces in front of him. An old man clutching a cross, a woman holding a child, a boy no older than 14. He raised his rifle. The barrel trembled. Then he whispered, so quietly that only he could hear it, "I can't." He lowered the weapon. The sergeant's shout was immediate, furious. "What did you say?" Otto turned and faced him. His voice was shaking, but his eyes were steady. "I said I can't." For a second, the world was silent, the kind of silence that hangs before thunder. Then Weber struck him across the face with his pistol. Otto fell into the snow, his vision blurred. He heard gunfire, short bursts. When he opened his eyes again, the pit was still. The civilians were gone. Weber stood over him. "You're lucky I don't shoot you too." "Get up, coward." Otto didn't move. His body ached, but what hurt more was the sound that would never leave him. The echo of gunfire that he refused to add his own shot to. That night, Weber wrote in the unit log, "Private Müller, insubordination during cleansing operation, to be transferred for disciplinary review." But even Weber hesitated before signing it. He knew what that meant. Transfer to a penal battalion, or worse, the Gestapo. He looked at the boy asleep in the corner of the barracks, shivering under a thin blanket. For the first time, the sergeant wondered if maybe it was he, not the boy, who should feel ashamed. Before dawn, Otto wrote a letter to his mother. He didn't dare tell the truth. Censorship was strict, and every word was read by officers. But between the lines, hidden in careful phrasing, he tried to confess, "The winter is cold, and sometimes I feel far from God. I try to remember what Father said about honor, but here it is hard to know what that means. Tell Anna to keep her heart kind. There is little kindness left here." He sealed it, knowing it might never reach home. In the weeks that followed, Otto's refusal became an unspoken secret among the men. They didn't talk about it, not because they disagreed, but because they were afraid. Some looked at him with contempt, others with quiet respect. War had made them numb, but seeing one man still capable of saying no reminded them that conscience hadn't died completely. A month later, the order came through. Otto Müller was to be reassigned to Penal Battalion 999, the infamous Strafbataillon used for disciplinary soldiers. It was, in effect, a death sentence. Before he left, Sergeant Weber handed him a small piece of paper. No signature, no unit mark. It said only, "What you did took more courage than what we do every day. Don't lose that." Otto folded the note carefully and hid it inside his boot. As he climbed aboard the transport truck headed east, he looked back at the snow-covered village one last time. The pit was gone. The bodies buried. But the memory stayed, a wound that never healed. The train rattled eastward for 3 days. Its cars were cold, unlit, filled with soldiers who weren't really soldiers anymore. Some wore tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, others only rags. They were the condemned, men who had disobeyed, deserted, or simply spoken too honestly. On the manifest, they were listed as redeployable offenders. In truth, they were disposable. Private Otto Müller sat among them, staring through a slit in the wooden boards. The landscape outside was a blur of snow and smoke, the endless gray of the Eastern Front. A man beside him, gaunt and hollow-eyed, asked quietly, "What did they get you for?" Otto hesitated. "Disobedience." The man nodded as if that explained everything. "We all disobeyed something. Orders, fear, or God." When the doors finally opened, the stench of smoke and fuel hit them like a wall. They had arrived at Camp Ostfeld, a penal encampment near Smolensk. Barbed wire ringed the perimeter. Inside, guards shouted, dogs barked, and emaciated men shoveled snow under the watch of SS overseers. A sergeant barked, "You're no longer soldiers. You're tools. You'll dig, carry, build, or die trying. And if you run, we shoot." Otto kept his head down. His once clean uniform was now torn and stained. The insignia of the Wehrmacht still clung to his sleeve, a bitter reminder of what he used to be. That night he slept on straw, surrounded by men muttering in their sleep. Prayers, curses, names. He dreamed of the pit. The commandant of the camp was Major Hans Richter, a veteran from the Polish campaign. He had lost his son on the Eastern Front and his sanity soon after. To him, the men of the penal battalion were not soldiers, but sins made flesh. He made them dig trenches for tanks that would never come, lay mines without detectors, and march through swamps to test for hidden explosives. Each morning, he read their punishments aloud like a priest reciting scripture. One day, he stopped in front of Otto, Private Müller, insubordination during anti-partisan action. "You refused to fire. Why?" Otto met his eyes. "Because it was wrong." A silence spread through the campyard. Richter's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "Then you'll have plenty of chances to test your morals here." Their first assignment was to clear a minefield outside the camp, using shovels, not equipment. Every few minutes, a dull explosion rolled across the snow as another man vanished into dust. Otto worked slowly, methodically. He watched the patterns, the soil, the wind, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he survived. At dusk, as he returned to camp, he saw a man trapped under debris from an explosion, his leg torn open, blood seeping into the ice. The guards ignored him. Otto knelt, ripped his own sleeve, and tied a tourniquet. The man, barely conscious, whispered, "Why help me? We're all dead anyway." Otto didn't answer. He just said, "Not today." That night, a medical orderly visited the barracks. Dr. Ernst Vogel, once a surgeon in Munich, now exiled to the penal camp for criticizing the regime. He saw Otto's bandaged hands and asked, "You helped the wounded one?" Otto nodded. Vogel smiled faintly. "You'll learn, boy. In this place, every act of mercy is rebellion." The doctor slipped him a small crust of bread. "Eat. If you live, remember this. Conscience is the last thing they can't take." Those words stayed with Otto longer than any order ever had. Weeks blurred into months. Every day new faces arrived. Fewer survived. But one night in March 1943, an explosion ripped through the eastern gate, partisans attacking the camp. Amid the chaos, Vogel grabbed Otto's arm. "Now! This is your chance." Otto hesitated. "And you?" Vogel shook his head. "I can't run anymore." "But you can. Don't waste it." He pushed Otto toward the breach. Gunfire cracked across the compound. Otto sprinted through smoke and snow, diving into the forest beyond. He didn't look back. Not until dawn. For days, Otto wandered through frozen woods, surviving on melted snow and bark. He followed distant gunfire, hoping to find the front line. Any line. On the fourth day, he stumbled upon a small partisan camp hidden beneath pine trees. The fighters, Russians and Belarusians, young and ragged, aimed rifles at him immediately. He raised his hands. "I'm not your enemy." One of them, a woman with a rifle slung over her shoulder, stepped forward. "All Germans say that before they shoot," Otto replied softly. "I refuse to shoot." Something in his tone, or in his eyes, made her pause. They didn't kill him. The partisans didn't trust him at first. He ate alone, slept at the edge of camp. But when he helped a wounded fighter dress his burns, they began to see him differently. Their leader, an older man named Alexei, told him, "You were born on the wrong side of the war, German, but maybe not on the wrong side of conscience." Otto worked quietly, gathering firewood, carrying the wounded, fixing what he could. He didn't fight. He refused. But he helped them live. In that frozen forest, among enemies turned friends, Otto Müller found something the Reich could never offer: peace without orders. One morning, a partisan brought in a German propaganda leaflet dropped from planes overhead. It showed a picture of Otto's face. The caption read, "Deserter Müller, traitor to the fatherland, wanted for cowardice and treason." Alexei looked at him and said, "Then you can never go back." Otto nodded. He hadn't planned to. Through 1943 and into 1944, Otto lived as a ghost in the forest. Not a soldier, not quite a partisan, but something in between. He carried no weapon. He tended to the sick. He buried the dead. And each night, before he slept, he whispered the same words. "I did not shoot. It wasn't pride. It was survival of the soul." The forest was his home now. No walls, no orders. Only wind, snow, and the rustle of partisans whispering in a dozen languages. By spring 1943, Otto Müller had become a ghost on the Eastern Front. The Germans wanted him dead. The Soviets didn't believe he existed. The partisans called him der stumme Deutsche, the silent German. He spoke little, worked much, and never carried a gun. To them, he was strange, a man who had fought for the enemy but refused to kill. Yet when wounded fighters needed bandages, when the sick needed water, when the dead needed to be buried, Otto was always there. He belonged to no one, and that, in a world of flags and orders, made him freer than most, but also more alone. One morning, Soviet soldiers stumbled upon the partisan camp. They surrounded it in silence, rifles raised. A captain stepped forward, barking Russian. Alexei, the partisan leader, tried to explain, but the officer's gaze locked on Otto. He saw the worn Wehrmacht uniform beneath the partisan coat. "You! German! Hands up!" Otto obeyed. They dragged him to a nearby village, converted into a Red Army outpost. He was thrown into a wooden shed that smelled of fuel and fear. A Soviet major entered. "You claim to be with the partisans, yet you wear that uniform. Why should I believe you?" Otto's voice was quiet. "Because I refused their orders. I refused to shoot." The major studied him. He had seen many Germans, arrogant, cruel, broken, but never one who spoke like this. He said finally, "Then prove it. Help us." Otto was assigned to a supply unit at the edge of the forest, guarded, unarmed, but alive. He carried crates, mended torn boots, hauled fuel through the mud. At first the soldiers spat near him, muttering "Fritz" and "dog." But one night, a mortar shell hit their camp, collapsing a trench. Without thinking, Otto rushed toward the explosion. He dug through the earth with his bare hands until he pulled a young Russian soldier free. The boy, barely 16, coughed up dirt and blood, then whispered, "Why? You help me." Otto replied simply, "Because you are not my enemy." The boy survived. Word spread, and slowly, the hatred around him began to thaw. Months later, a Red Cross parcel arrived at the Soviet post. Inside, among prisoner lists and letters, was one addressed to Private Otto Müller, presumed missing. The Soviets gave it to him, suspicious but curious. The handwriting was his sister's, Mother says she prays for you every night. The neighbors say you're dead, but I know you're not. If you can read this, remember who you are. No order can take that from you." Otto folded the letter carefully and pressed it to his chest. It was the first time in 2 years he had felt warmth that wasn't from fire. One evening, a German patrol stumbled across the Soviet line near the supply camp. Gunfire erupted. Otto froze. Bullets tore through the trees, voices shouting in German, his mother tongue, ordering death. He crawled toward a wounded Soviet soldier gasping in the mud. The man's leg was mangled, his rifle lost. Otto dragged him to cover, shielding him with his body as German bullets hissed overhead. A familiar voice cut through the noise. Deep, commanding, unmistakable. "Müller! Otto Müller! Is that you?" Otto looked up and saw him. Sergeant Weber, the man who had once ordered him to shoot. For a heartbeat, time froze. Snow fell between them, white against the smoke. Weber stepped closer, lowering his weapon slightly. "They said you were dead." Otto stood slowly, hands raised. "Maybe I am." Weber's eyes hardened. "You're with the Russians now?" "I'm with no one." Weber aimed his rifle. "You disobeyed your country, your comrades. Now you help our enemies. You've shamed everything we fought for." Otto's voice didn't shake this time. "You call it fighting. I call it killing." For a moment Weber said nothing. Then, almost gently, "You were always too soft for this war." A gunshot cracked, but not from Weber. A Soviet sniper in the trees had seen the silhouette of a German uniform. Weber fell backward into the snow, the rifle slipping from his hand. Otto knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his chest. Weber's blood spread fast. He stared at Otto, eyes glassy. "You still refused to shoot?" Otto nodded. "Yes." Weber's breath rattled, then stopped. At dawn, Otto buried Weber under the birch trees. He used his bare hands. He placed the sergeant's helmet atop the mound of snow and whispered, "You followed orders. I followed silence. Neither of us won." When he returned to camp, no one asked what had happened. They only saw the haunted look in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen mercy cost more than death. By late 1944, as the Red Army advanced westward, Otto was given a choice. A Soviet officer handed him papers stamped in Cyrillic. "You helped us. You can stay in the rear, work as a translator, or you can go west. But if the Germans find you, they'll hang you." Otto looked at the paper, then at the horizon. "I'm done hiding." He joined a group of displaced civilians moving toward Poland. Refugees, orphans, widows. He pushed their carts, carried their children, shared his rations. In their eyes, he saw exhaustion but also trust. For once, he wasn't just surviving, he was saving. In January 1945, as the refugees reached a ruined bridge near the Vistula River, they were caught in crossfire between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. Chaos erupted. Civilians scattered. Otto ran back across the bridge to help a trapped woman with her child. A shell exploded nearby, collapsing the structure. He lifted the child with shaking arms, blood running down his face. He shouted to the Soviet soldiers on the far bank, "Take her! She's not part of this!" They reached out, pulling the child to safety. When Otto tried to follow, the bridge gave way. He plunged into the freezing water below. The current carried him beneath the ice. For a moment, the world was soundless, only the echo of gunfire fading above. Then silence. The next morning, when the Soviets crossed the river, they found the bridge destroyed, and one man's coat caught on a splintered beam. Inside the pocket was a folded paper, water-stained but legible. It read, "If anyone finds this, tell my mother I never shot. Tell her I tried to stay human." The Soviet officer who read it said nothing. He folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Years later, he would give it to a museum. May 1945. The guns had fallen silent, but the world was still full of ghosts. Germany was rubble, cities shattered, streets lined with ruins and hunger. Every survivor carried a secret. What they had done, what they had seen, or what they had refused to do. In the small Bavarian village of Badenried, an old woman stood outside her house clutching a faded photograph. Her son, Otto Müller, had been missing for 3 years. Every night she lit a candle on the windowsill, just in case he found his way home. Her daughter, Anna, had stopped believing long ago. "Mother, the war is over. If he were alive, we'd have heard by now." The old woman's voice trembled. "I would know." A mother knows when her child is gone, and when he's still out there. In 1946, a Soviet archivist in Warsaw opened a box of recovered personal effects, scraps of paper, dog tags, and fragments from the front lines. Among them was a small, water-stained note written in German. "If anyone finds this, tell my mother I never shot. Tell her I tried to stay human." The archivist, not knowing the name Otto Müller, placed it aside with hundreds of other unclaimed artifacts. But a Red Cross volunteer, a Polish nurse named Elena Wozniak, found the words haunting. She copied them into her diary, noting, "This letter sounds like a prayer, not from a hero, but from a soul begging to be understood." A year later, in 1947, British intelligence officer Captain Alan Whitaker was assigned to a special project, documenting war crimes and unusual reports from the Eastern Front. He came across Elena's note. The handwriting, she said, belonged to a young German soldier. Whitaker frowned. "A German who refused to shoot? That's rare." Intrigued, he began searching Wehrmacht disciplinary archives. In a faded field log from 1942, he found it. Private Otto Müller, insubordination during anti-partisan operation near Vitebsk, refused direct order to execute civilians, transferred to Strafbattalion 999. There was no further record, no burial, no commendation, no execution. Just a name, a punishment, and a silence. Whitaker traveled to southern Germany, tracing family registries and military lists. In December 1947, he found the Müller family in Badenried. Anna opened the door, thin, pale, her eyes hollow. "We've had enough of soldiers," she said at first. But when he mentioned Otto's name, her face changed. Inside, Whitaker sat across from their mother, who clutched Otto's last letter. "He wrote about the cold, about missing home," she said softly, "but never about what he saw." Whitaker placed the recovered note on the table. She stared at it, hands trembling. "That's his handwriting," she whispered. "He was always neat, even as a boy." Tears filled her eyes. "He said he'd never shoot. I thought it was just a promise to God. I didn't know it was the truth." Before leaving, Whitaker asked if she had anything that belonged to Otto. She handed him a small wooden cross, roughly carved, worn smooth by touch. "He made it for me before the war," she said. "Said he'd keep one and I'd keep the other, so we'd never be apart." Whitaker noticed faint letters etched on the back. "For das was Richtigist," for what is right. He took a photograph of the cross and returned it to her. Then he wrote in his report, "This soldier's defiance, though small, represents the greatest act of resistance, to remain moral in an immoral world." In 1948, a short article appeared in a London newspaper. "The German who refused to shoot." A British investigator has uncovered the story of a young Wehrmacht soldier who defied an order to execute civilians and was sent to a penal battalion. His fate remains unknown. His final letter reads simply, "I tried to stay human." The story drew mixed reactions. Some readers dismissed it as propaganda, an attempt to redeem the enemy. Others wrote letters to the editor saying, "If even one man said no, then perhaps there's hope for us all." In Germany, the article was banned by the occupation authorities for being politically sensitive. But word spread anyway, whispered in cafes, in churches, in classrooms where teachers dared to mention conscience. In 1952, a schoolteacher in Munich, Franz Böhmer, included Otto's story in a lesson about moral courage. He didn't name him. He just called him the soldier who refused to shoot. The students were silent for a long time. Then one girl raised her hand. "Was he punished?" Böhmer nodded. "Yes." "Then why did he do it?" He looked at the blackboard where he had written one sentence from the letter. "Tell her I tried to stay human." And he said quietly, because that was all he had left. 2 decades later, in 1965, Elena Wozniak's diary was published in Poland as part of a collection titled Voices from the Ruins. Among its pages was the copied note, now known to readers across Europe as the Forgotten Cross. Historians began searching again for its origin. In West Germany, an archive curator recognized the handwriting from earlier case files. Within months, Otto Müller's name reappeared in history, no longer as a number in a war record, but as a man who said no. In 1970, a small plaque was placed at the Resistance Memorial in Ulm. It bore no rank, no title, only words. To the unknown soldier who refused to shoot. He obeyed his conscience when the world obeyed fear. Visitors left flowers, notes, and photographs of loved ones lost to war. Some said prayers. Some simply stood in silence. And among the candles, someone once left a small wooden cross, just like the one Otto had carved for his mother. History never found his body. No grave, no medal, no ceremony. But his refusal echoed louder than 1,000 orders obeyed. And though he died unnamed, his defiance lived on, in every soldier, student, and soul who ever faced a choice between doing what is commanded and doing what is right. As one historian later wrote, his weapon was conscience. His victory was silence. The reunification of Germany had opened old archives, Soviet, East German, Wehrmacht. Historians, journalists, and students pored over dusty files, searching for forgotten stories. Among them was Dr. Clara Reinhardt, a young historian from Hamburg working on her thesis, Conscience and Defiance in the Wehrmacht. She had read the story of the soldier who refused to shoot in a 1950s newspaper clipping found in her grandfather's attic. Her professor told her it was just a myth, a moral fairy tale. But something in the simplicity of those words, "Tell her I tried to stay human," at tender, haunted her. She decided to find out if the man was real. Weeks into her research, Clara sat deep in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, the German Federal Archives. Rows upon rows of yellowed folders surrounded her, labeled in the stiff, bureaucratic handwriting of another era. She traced disciplinary records of Wehrmacht soldiers convicted of insubordination in 1942. Thousands had been executed for disobedience. Then, buried in a file marked Strafbattalion 9999, Transfers and Losses, she found a name. Private Otto Müller. Disciplinary transfer, Eastern Front, 1942. Status, missing, presumed dead, 1943. And below that, an annotation in red pencil, faint but legible, refused to carry out liquidation order. Her hands trembled slightly. After 50 years, the myth had a name again. Clara requested access to Soviet records, now partially open to researchers. She traveled to Moscow, to the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, a cold concrete building where history slept behind iron doors. Through translators and piles of declassified files, she found fragments, a Soviet field report from January 1945 mentioning unidentified German male found deceased near Vistula Crossing, carried no weapon. In his coat, note stating refusal to execute civilians, body unrecovered due to river conditions. The location matched the last known point of Otto's disappearance. The bridge, the river, the note. Clara whispered to herself, he was real. While following leads in Warsaw, she met Elena Wozniak, now an elderly woman in her 80s, the same Red Cross volunteer who had found Otto's note after the war. They met in a small apartment filled with fading photographs and the smell of tea. Elena smiled when she heard the name. I've waited half my life for someone to ask about him again. She took out her old diary, the same one where she had copied the letter. I never forgot those words, she said softly. They were different. So many letters I read were angry or desperate. His was peaceful. Clara asked, Did you ever see his body? Elena shook her head. No, but maybe that's good, because men like him don't die in one place. They live where people remember why they refused. Through Elena's contacts, Clara was introduced to a retired Soviet officer named Major Sergei Antonov, who had served on the Eastern Front and later worked in prisoner documentation. He met her at a small cafe near the Vistula. After some hesitation, he handed her a worn envelope. Inside was a photograph, a black and white portrait of a young German soldier, his face calm, serious, eyes slightly sad. I took this from the belongings of the man we found by the river, Antonov said. I kept it because he looked different, not proud, not cruel, just human. Clara compared the image to old Wehrmacht personnel files. The serial number on the uniform matched. It was Otto Müller. For a long time she said nothing. Then, almost to herself, he finally has his face back. Back in Germany, Clara tracked down descendants of the Müller family. Anna had passed away in the 1970s, but her daughter, Elizabeth, Otto's niece, was still alive. When Clara visited her, Elizabeth was living in a small nursing home near Augsburg. She kept an old wooden box by her bedside. Inside were two items: a faded photograph of Otto as a boy and a small wooden cross. Clara told her what she had found: the archives, the letter, the eyewitness accounts. Elizabeth listened silently, tears welling. "All my life," she whispered, "my grandmother said Otto was not a coward. He was the bravest of us all. Now I can finally prove she was right." Clara gave her a copy of the recovered photograph. Elizabeth traced her fingers over his face. "He looks like he's still asking the world a question." In 1998, the German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin unveiled a new exhibit titled Voices of Conscience. Among the letters, diaries, and artifacts was Otto Müller's reconstructed story: the letter, the photograph, and the cross. Visitors stopped before the display, reading the brief plaque. Private Otto Müller, 1923-1945, Wehrmacht infantry, convicted of insubordination after refusing to execute civilians. Escaped from a penal battalion, aided Soviet partisans, and died saving refugees during the Vistula crossing. His final letter reads, "Tell my mother I never shot. Tell her I tried to stay human." One elderly man stood before the glass for a long time, whispering, "We all had orders. Only a few remembered their soul." Years later, Clara published her book, The Soldier Who Refused to Shoot, a true story of conscience in war. It combined Otto's life with the testimonies of other soldiers who hesitated, resisted, or silently rebelled. In the final chapter she wrote, "History celebrates victory, condemns defeat, but rarely honors those who stood still." Otto Müller's refusal was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of remembrance. He remembered what it meant to be human when the world had forgotten. The book received quiet praise, not loud acclaim, but gratitude. Teachers used it in schools. Veterans wept while reading it. And one letter from a former soldier said, "I wish I had his courage. I obeyed when I should have refused. His story freed me to admit that." In 2001, Elizabeth Müller donated her family's wooden cross to the memorial in Berlin. She placed it beside Otto's photograph and whispered, "Now you're home." That night, Clara walked through the dimly lit hall after the museum closed. She stood before the display: the cross, the letter, the faded photograph. In the reflection on the glass, she saw her own face beside his. She whispered, "You didn't just refuse to shoot, Otto. You refused to forget." The hall was silent, but it felt alive, as if the conscience of one forgotten soldier still lingered, watching, waiting, reminding. By the early 2000s, Otto Müller's name began appearing in history journals and classrooms, not as a hero in uniform, but as a question. What does it mean to obey, and what does it mean to refuse? His story unsettled people. In a country that had spent decades trying to come to terms with its past, Otto's quiet defiance blurred the lines between guilt and redemption. For some, he was proof that not all Germans were blind followers. For others, he was an inconvenient reminder that most did not refuse. That morality under dictatorship was a choice, not an impossibility. In 2003, a German public broadcaster produced a documentary titled "The Soldier Who Refused to Shoot." The film opened with Clara Reinhardt's discovery of Otto's photograph, followed by reenacted scenes from the Eastern Front, a soldier lowering his rifle as others fired. The film sparked debate across the nation. At a televised roundtable, historians, veterans, and ethicists sat beneath bright studio lights. A former officer said, "In war, you obey or you die." He was brave, yes, but his refusal changed nothing. A younger voice, a historian, replied, "You're wrong. The act of saying no is never nothing. It's a line drawn in history that others can follow." Clara, sitting quietly in the audience, felt both pride and sorrow. Otto's story was finally being told. But she could see how even now people struggled to understand the price of conscience. Months later, Clara was invited to speak at a secondary school in Hamburg. She brought Otto's photograph and a copy of his letter. She asked the students, "How many of you think you would have done the same?" A few hands went up, hesitantly. Then one boy asked, "But what's the point if they shoot you for refusing?" Clara smiled sadly. "Maybe the point isn't survival. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's about leaving something behind that says, 'We were not all lost.'" That day, she saw the same flicker in their faces that she imagined Otto had carried in his. A small, stubborn light that refused to go out. Not everyone welcomed Otto's recognition. Some academics accused Clara of moral romanticism, saying she had turned one isolated act into a myth of redemption. One article in Der Historiker argued, "By elevating individual defiance, we risk forgiving collective guilt." Clara responded publicly, "No story can erase guilt. But stories like Otto's show that guilt was not inevitable, that choices existed, even when death was the price." Her words struck a nerve. In the years that followed, universities began hosting panels titled "The Ethics of Obedience." Otto Müller's case became a centerpiece of moral philosophy courses across Europe. In 2007, while preparing a new edition of her book, Clara received a letter from a man in Minsk. It was written by Yakov Levin, the son of a Jewish woman who had survived the massacre near Vitebsk, the same massacre Otto had refused to take part in. "My mother spoke of a young German soldier who lowered his gun. She said his hands were shaking, but his eyes were kind. He shouted something in German. She didn't understand the words, but she thought it meant he wouldn't shoot." Yakov attached a photograph. His mother, taken in 1946, holding her child in front of a refugee camp. She lived because someone chose not to obey. "I grew up because of that man." Clara sat at her desk for a long time, reading the letter again and again. The act that history almost erased had, in truth, saved a life, and through it, generations. In 2010, the Resistance Memorial in Berlin hosted a ceremony for the unveiling of a new plaque, "To Otto Müller and all those who refuse to obey criminal orders." Clara was asked to speak. The hall was filled with survivors, veterans, students, and the children of soldiers who had fought on both sides. She began softly. Otto Müller was not a saint. He was a soldier, like millions of others. But in one moment, he remembered he was also a human being. She paused, looking at the audience. He refused to shoot, and in doing so, he shot a hole in the lie that obedience is virtue. The hall was silent. Then slowly, people began to rise to their feet, not in applause but in shared recognition, that in Otto's story they saw both their shame and their hope. Later that evening, after the ceremony, Clara stood outside the memorial under a soft drizzle. She was joined by an old man, a retired teacher. He said, "I was a boy during the war. My father was in the Wehrmacht, too. I grew up thinking there were no good men left. Then I read about Otto. It didn't make my father innocent, but it made me believe goodness didn't die entirely." He handed her a small medal. His father's Iron Cross. Please, give this to the museum. It belongs among the stories of those who remembered what it was for. By 2015, Otto Müller's story had become part of Germany's National Education Archive. His face appeared in documentaries, his words quoted in ethics textbooks, his cross displayed beside those of resistance martyrs. But one detail remained unresolved: his burial. Despite years of searching, no confirmed grave was ever found. Some said his body was swept down the Vistula. Others believed partisans buried him in secret, fearing retribution. The truth, like Otto himself, remained somewhere between history and faith. In 2019, marking the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, Clara was invited to speak again, this time not as a historian, but as the curator of Otto's legacy. Standing before cameras, she said, "We often think of history as written by victors, but sometimes the truest parts of it are written by the ones who disobeyed." Otto Müller never led a rebellion, never commanded troops, never won a medal. Yet, in refusing to shoot, he won back a small piece of humanity for all of us. She looked into the crowd, students, teachers, journalists, and concluded, "He was almost erased from history, but conscience once spoken never dies. It waits for us to listen." By the 2020s, Otto Müller's name had traveled far beyond Germany. In classrooms across Europe, his story was taught not as propaganda or redemption, but as an ethical question, one that every generation must face anew. In military academies, young cadets studied his letter as part of their courses on the laws of war. In philosophy departments, students debated whether morality can survive when obedience is demanded above all else. And in quiet corners of the world, in places where soldiers still fought wars they didn't believe in, Otto's words were whispered like a prayer. "I tried to stay human." In 2008, a NATO officer serving in Afghanistan wrote in his journal, "We are told to follow orders without question." But last night, I read the story of Otto Müller, the German soldier who refused to kill unarmed civilians. I realized that the hardest part of war isn't dying for your country. It's living with what you do in its name. Years later, that same journal would be published, and soldiers around the world would underline those same sentences, the ones that traced their own fears. Otto's defiance had crossed generations, languages, and uniforms. He had become more than a soldier. He was now a mirror, reflecting what every human faces when duty collides with conscience. At a university in Paris, a philosophy professor named Dr. Alain Moreau opened his lecture on ethics with Otto's letter. He wrote the words on the blackboard in chalk. "Tell my mother I never shot." Then he turned to his students. "History is full of killers who obeyed, but only a few remembered that obedience without morality is just another form of cowardice." A student asked, "But professor, if refusing means death, is that still courage? Or is it suicide?" Moreau paused, smiling faintly. "When a man refuses to become a machine, he chooses to live, even if he dies for it." The classroom fell silent, and in that silence, the moral weight of Otto's choice lingered. Heavy, sacred, undeniable. In 2012, an international documentary titled "Conscience in Uniform" aired across multiple countries. The film featured stories of soldiers who had defied unlawful orders, from Vietnam to Bosnia to Iraq. But it opened with Otto's photograph. The narrator spoke softly over the image. He was 19 when he refused to fire. He died unknown, but the echo of that refusal has outlived every gun that tried to silence it. The film won awards for its honesty and depth. Viewers described it as a haunting reminder that morality does not wear a uniform. In one post-screening discussion, a veteran stood and said, "I wish someone had told us his story 50 years ago. Maybe fewer of us would have done what we were told." In 2016, a German teacher named Marta Klein brought Otto's story into her classroom in Munich. She told her students, "History isn't only about battles won. It's also about the moments someone said no." A young boy raised his hand. Was Otto a hero? Marta smiled gently. Heroes fight enemies. Otto fought himself. That's harder. After class, she found a note on her desk written by one of her quieter students. My grandfather was in the army. He never spoke about it. But I think now I know why. Maybe he couldn't refuse. But I'll remember the one who did. That evening, Marta placed Otto's photograph on the classroom wall, beside a quote from his letter. It became a tradition. Every new class would read it at the end of the term, not as a story about Germany, but as a story about humanity. In 2019, a permanent exhibit titled Conscience Under Fire opened at the German Historical Museum in Berlin. At its center was a dimly lit display. Otto's photograph, his wooden cross, and the translation of his final note. Visitors walked through in silence. The soundscape was composed only of whispers, fragments of soldiers' letters from across the world, read softly in multiple languages. A placard beside Otto's display read, "The refusal to obey is not the end of loyalty. It is the beginning of humanity." Every year, thousands of visitors left behind small tokens, rosaries, dog tags, folded notes, and in one case, a simple message written in pencil. For Otto, because conscience is the only weapon that never runs out of bullets. In 2021, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, added Otto Müller's letter to the memory of the World Register, preserving it as part of humanity's moral heritage. The official citation read, "The letter represents the universal struggle between obedience and morality, a testament to the courage of individual conscience under totalitarianism." Clara Reinhardt, now older and retired, attended the ceremony. As she stood on stage, she remembered the first day she found his name in the archives. 50 years of silence, finally broken. "He wasn't a hero," she said softly into the microphone. "He was a boy who remembered he had a soul." The audience rose in applause, not loud, but reverent, like a prayer that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. In 2023, a German lieutenant deployed with a UN peacekeeping mission wrote a letter home. "When orders feel wrong, I think of Otto Müller. He reminds me that bravery isn't in firing the shot, it's in knowing when not to." That letter was later published anonymously in a German newspaper. Within weeks, it went viral, shared across borders, armies, and languages. Young soldiers from dozens of countries began writing to one another, sharing Otto's words, tattooing them, quoting them. He had become the conscience of the forgotten, the unseen, the ones who doubted. Otto Müller's story became a global touchstone, not only for soldiers, but for anyone facing the weight of authority. Activists quoted him in movements against oppression. Journalists cited him in articles about whistleblowers. Priests mentioned him in sermons about faith. He was no longer just a soldier in a uniform. He was a reminder that one voice of refusal could echo across centuries. As Clara Reinhardt wrote in her final essay before her passing, "Empires fall, dictators die, but the echo of one man whispering no, that endures." On a cold evening in Berlin, a group of students gathered at Otto's memorial. They lit candles, read his letter aloud, and stood in silence. A young girl said quietly, "He's the kind of soldier I wish every country had." The flickering light reflected off the words engraved in stone. He refused to shoot, and beneath it, someone had carved 3 new words, barely visible but eternal. He stayed human. Decades turned into generations. The faces of the war faded from photographs into history books. The ruins were rebuilt, the uniforms folded away, the medals tarnished with time. But one thing did not fade: a single letter written by a young German soldier who refused to kill. It survived bombings, governments, and archives. It survived not because it was perfect, but because it was true. "Tell my mother I never shot. Tell her I tried to stay human." Those words became more than a confession. They became a mirror held up to every generation that followed. In 2025, an American tourist named Michael Evans visited Berlin's Resistance Memorial. He was a history teacher traveling alone, tracing stories of courage for his students back home. He paused before the glass case containing Otto's letter and the wooden cross. Behind him, schoolchildren whispered softly, guided by a teacher explaining the exhibit. Michael read the text again, the handwriting faint but clear. He leaned closer and whispered, "You'd never believe how far your words have traveled." Kid, he took a photograph, not for social media, but to print and hang in his classroom, beside portraits of Lincoln, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King, Jr. When he returned home, he began every class the same way. There was once a soldier who refused to shoot. In 2027, a Syrian poet living in exile published a collection titled The Man Who Said No. The dedication read, "To Otto Müller, who proved that silence can scream louder than bullets." One of her poems read, "He lowered his gun, and the world called him weak. But the earth remembers his breath, not his silence. He fell, but his refusal still stands." Her book was banned in several countries, but translated and shared secretly, quoted in protests, recited by young people standing unarmed before tanks. In 2030, a new memorial was unveiled in Geneva, Switzerland. It stood not for generals or leaders, but for those who had refused, those who had disobeyed orders to commit atrocities, no matter the nation or flag. At the center of the marble plaza was a bronze figure, a soldier kneeling, his rifle lowered, his head bowed in thought. On the base, the inscription read, "Dedicated to those who refused to kill the innocent." Inspired by the true story of Private Otto Müller, world leaders attended the unveiling. For a brief, solemn moment, the applause that followed felt like a heartbeat shared by millions who finally understood. The greatest victory is over one's own fear. In her final years, before passing away in 2032, Dr. Clara Reinhardt kept a small desk in her home near Hamburg. Above it hung Otto's photograph. On her last recorded interview, she said, "When I found his name, he was just a line in an old report. But history is built from such lines. Each one is a pulse, faint but alive. We only have to listen." Her final manuscript, published posthumously, ended with these words, "If Otto Müller's act had no witnesses, no reward, and no survival, yet still matters 80 years later, then perhaps that's proof enough that morality does not die with men. It waits for courage to remember it." One spring morning in 2035, a young girl named Lena, no older than 10, visited the Berlin Museum with her father. She stopped before the display, reading the note in silence. "Papa," she asked, "why didn't he shoot?" Her father knelt beside her, struggling for words. "Because he remembered what it means to be good, even when everyone else forgot." Lena stared at the letter, then pulled something from her small backpack, a folded paper cross she had made in school. She placed it carefully beside the display. "He can have mine," she said. That photograph, of the tiny paper cross beside the wooden one, would go viral online, viewed by millions, captioned simply, "The legacy continues." In 2040, a research team from Poland finally unearthed remains near the Vistula crossing, a shallow burial with fragments of a Wehrmacht belt and a rusted identification tag. The tag read, "Müller, Otto 32451, infantry DNA testing confirmed it." 88 years after he vanished, Otto Müller was finally found. His remains were reburied at the German War Cemetery in Malbork under a simple stone. Private Otto Müller, 1923–1945. He refused to shoot. No anthem was played. No speech was made. Only silence. The kind of silence that honors more than words ever could. Years passed, and Otto's story entered every language. His letter became part of the UNESCO digital archive titled Voices of Conscience. Students studied him in Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Nairobi, and New York. In one lecture hall, a professor said, "Otto Müller fought no battles and won no medals, yet his refusal echoes longer than any victory parade." The world would always have new wars, new tyrants, and new soldiers faced with impossible orders. But somewhere, in every generation, there would be one who remembered his name. And in that remembrance, Otto Müller lived on, not as a ghost of war, but as the conscience of peace. On the 100th anniversary of the end of World War II, in 2045, a global broadcast featured memorials from across continents. In Berlin, as dusk fell, the Resistance Memorial was lit by hundreds of candles. Among them, one burned slightly brighter. Beside it lay a photograph of Otto, the letter, and the two crosses, wooden and paper. A recording of Clara's voice played softly through the speakers. He was one among millions. But he remembered that even in war, the soul does not take orders. The crowd stood in silence. Then, one voice, a young soldier from another war, another time, whispered what had become the prayer of those who dared to feel human. I will remember Otto Müller, and when the order comes, I will choose like he did. In the quiet of eternity, history forgets many names, but not his, because Otto Müller didn't fight for victory. He fought for the soul of mankind, and in every moment where a man or woman hesitates before injustice, where conscience outweighs fear, his spirit stands beside them, the eternal soldier who refused to shoot.